Hello, my name is Brett Spence, and today we'll be talking about Japanese occupied Singapore, which the Japanese called Santo. Alright, let's begin. After Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore to General Tomoyuki Yamashita on February 15th, 1942, and the Japanese renamed the island to Santo, which means Light of the South, the Japanese committed many atrocities before and after the fall of Singapore. On the 14th of February, the day before the surrender, the Japanese massacred wounded soldiers and hospital personnel in the Alexandria Hospital, and after the surrender, the Japanese launched a bloody campaign against the Singapore's Chinese population due to many of them sending money to help China to fight the Japanese in the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese set up screening centers around Singapore and ordered all the Chinese men between 18 to 50 years old. They waited in long lines where they would be met by Japanese interrogators who questioned them like, "What do you work as? Do you work for the British? What is your dialect group? Do you speak English?" The person being questioned, knowing their answers would mean life and death. While being questioned, soldiers guarded a informant who wore a gunnery sack around their head, who whispered and nodded to the interrogators. Those who failed their screenings were set aside for execution. Those who passed their screenings were given a stamped piece of paper and allowed to leave. If the paper ran out, the stamps were put on their bodies or their clothes, with them being careful not to wash the stamps off. But the stamps did not always protect the holder. Sometimes the sentries would stop people leaving, removing their stamps and putting them with those sent to be executed. Those who were sent to be executed were put onto lorries to beaches or remote plantations on mostly the east side of the island, where the Japanese made their victims dig a large pit where they were forced in and were shot. Luckily, some people managed to escape, telling people what had happened, and after the war, reported the massacre. It's estimated that 50,000 to 70,000 men were killed on the beaches of Pungong, Changi, Tarawan, and Katong, and the plantations of Siglap and Bedok. The massacre became known as Zhuoqing Massacre. After the massacre, the Japanese army demanded $50 million from the remaining Chinese population. The Chinese sold anything valuable like their jewelry, land, and even their houses. But despite their best efforts, they were only managed to raise $28 million straight dollars and had to get the rest from a Japanese bank. In a ceremony at the Fulton Building, where the Chinese gave the cash to Tomoyuki Yamashita, where he lectured them on being good citizens and hoped that they had learned their lesson, then gave the Chinese a receipt and called the ransom a gift. After the fall of Singapore, the Allied garrison and the European citizens were sent on foot to Changi, where they'd been put in massive prison camps. They carried all their worldly possessions. The POWs were incarcerated in the barracks and the army buildings, while the citizens were interred in Changi prison, and in 1944 moved to Seam Road Camp. Like all prisons run by the Japanese, they were harsh and brutal, but the soldiers and civilians didn't let the Japanese break their spirit, so the officers formed Changi University, where the soldiers who came from all walks of life, so they set up lecturing halls and taught the soldiers music, farming, science, and other languages. The soldiers also set up a library and a theatre where they put on musical theatres and plays. But since prisoners of war are duty bound to escape, so it wasn't that long till two Australian POWs, Colonel Rodney Brevington and Private Victor Glay, escaped from Singapore by steering a sampan and sailed to Allied-controlled Ceylon, but unfortunately for them, they were captured by the Japanese when they were close to Ceylon in July. There was another escape attempt by two British soldiers, Howard Waters and Eric Fletcher, both privates, but were caught trying to escape Changi. The commander of the Japanese prison camp, General Shinpei Fuyuki, was furious and demanded the prisoners sign a no-escape pledge, which they refused. So Fuyuki ordered all 15,000 prisoners, including the sick, of Sharanga barracks out into the parade ground, where their food rations were cut in half and their water was down to a trickle from two taps. Despite the unbearable sun with no shade, but some soldiers managed to make makeshift tents out of anything they could get their hands on. It didn't help matters, they had to relieve themselves on the ground, making the place stink, and had one bottle of water for the day. On the 2nd of September, Furuki marched the 4 escapees to the beach to be executed by firing squad, despite Corporal Brevington pleading to spare Private Gale, but Fukuyuki was not moved and the 4 men were executed, with them refusing to be blindfolded. Despite this, the prisoners were not break, but on the 5th of September, after days of disease spreading through their ranks, the highest-ranking Allied officer, Colonel E.B. Holmes, ordered the men to sign the pledge, which they did with fictional names and allowed to return to their barracks. The civilians had no better, with them being sent to Changi prison, where the men were separated from the women and children and not allowed to talk or see each other, not even from a distance. They slept on straw mats and could only wash themselves when there was enough water. Due to them not having enough water to bathe, they were filthy, with them developing sores and rashes on their body and lice on their hair. When their supplies ran out, they made their own, with them using twigs and ash to wash their teeth and wash themselves with palm oil and potash. When their clothes started to fall apart, they made new clothes with whatever they could find, and they even grew a vegetable garden, but when it came to harvesting time, all the food harvested was seized by the guards. During their captivity, they kept themselves busy by cleaning their surroundings, setting up stage plays, music recitals, publishing their own newspapers, setting up schools for the children, and did sewing and quilting. Outside the prison, life was not much better, with the Japanese authorities imposing Japanese culture on the people of Singapore. The calendar was changed to the Japanese one. Time was set to Tokyo time. Shops and signs were now in Japanese. The currency was changed from the straight dollar to the Japanese military yen, nicknamed banana notes, and Japanese flags and sentries at major road junctions and public buildings. And when the locals see them, they quickly rebelled, and if you didn't, you would be furiously thrashed. When the schools reopened under Japanese administration, but most parents refused to take their kids to the reopened schools, and those who did attend, full Nipponization was in full swing, where they were taught Japanese, sing Japanese anthem and military songs, bowed northeast in the direction of the Imperial Palace, and celebrate Japanese festivals. Like the rest of the world, Singapore was also suffering from supply shortages, which led to the black market thriving and increased rationing, but it wasn't uncommon for shops and markets to be empty. To solve the food problem, the Japanese administration planned a Grow for Food campaign, where any piece of empty land were used for growing vegetables. Another scheme by the Japanese authorities was to get some of the population to farm in the Malay Peninsula, where there was more land available for farming. They picked Endu in Johor for the Chinese population and Baru in Negeri Sembilan for the Eurasian and Chinese Catholic population, and volunteers were given a few acres of land to build a house and a farm. But those who didn't take the offer risked being conscripted into the labor corps and forced to build airfields and trenches. This was more pressure for people to head north, and at Enu, the Chinese found life there quite comfortable. The land was good for farming, there was fresh water and close to Singapore to ask the authorities for supplies, which was granted till they could feed themselves, and by the end of the war, Enu became a town with 30,000 people with its own bank, paper factory, sawmill, school, and even restaurants. But at Bahau, things were worse, with Bahau having no bridges, railway tracks, houses, not even a road. They also discovered that the soil was poor and not suitable for farming, and they had to forage for food due to the fact that what they did manage to grow wasn't enough to feed them and were plagued by malaria. When the war was over, the communities of Endu and Bahau were abandoned. The people of Singapore lived in fear of the Japanese military police, known as the dreaded Kempeitai, who were basically the Japanese version of the Gestapo, where they hunted out spies and people who were not listening to Japanese-approved radio stations like Radio Tokyo. And if you were caught listening to programs like the BBC, you were sent to Outram Prison, where the Kempeitai, would torture you both physically and mentally. They would lock you in a tiny cell with hardly any food, water, light, deprived you of all human contact for months or even years. They forced people to their knees for hours in silence, with guards constantly checking on them to make sure they were staying still. Things only got worse after Operation J-Wing, a story for another time, where 3 Allied commandos sunk 3 ships and damaged 3 others. The Japanese believed it was sabotage and went on a rampage, with their first target being Changi Prison, where on October 10th, 1943, the Kempeitai ordered the prisoners to the parade ground and ransacked their cells. Since the prisoners were caught unprepared, the Kempeitai found homemade radios and the prison's newspaper. They were furious and went on a 7-month terror spree across the island. They arrested an Anglican bishop of Singapore and Choe Kai and his wife Elizabeth Choi, who were later believed to be smuggling medicine, letters, money, and food to Changi Prison. Elizabeth Choi was tortured for 193 days, where she was brutally beaten for hours, electrocuted, and worse. After the 200th day, she was released after they were convinced that she was innocent. She did not confess or divulge any information. The Double Tent incident saw 1 person executed, 15 died from torture carried out by the hands of the Kempeitai. As the war was coming to an end and defeat was likely, the Japanese started covering up their atrocities, with them destroying records at Outram Prison. The Kempeitai whitewashed their prison walls to remove all evidence of their crimes, but the prison doctor Lee Chi-sun and Clay Hai, the chief record cleric, stole 2 sets of incriminating records before they could be destroyed, and these records were used to charge the Japanese guards and officers with war crimes after the war was over. In August 1945, rumors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki getting nuked reached Singapore, and very later, news of Japan's surrender reached them. The commander of the garrison of Singapore, General Toshiro Ieyasu, wanted clarification of surrender and went to Saigon to confer with his superior, Field Marshal Count Terauchi. Terauchi told Ieyasu to comply with the surrender. In Singapore, some of the Japanese officers committed seppuku, so when the Allies arrived, first with paratroopers who landed in the POW camps, with the rest of the Allied army coming in on the 5th of September, the citizens of Singapore went out hunting for those who collaborated with the Japanese, and the collaborators fled Singapore and went into hiding. After the surrender ceremony, where the island was returned to British rule, on the 12th of September, the inmates of the Japanese prisons were released, and in January 1946, the Singapore war crime trials had begun, where 130 trials took place, where many were found guilty and sent to long prison sentences, with 135 of them being hanged. For the 7 Japanese officers that were found guilty for their role in the Shukcheng massacre, Lieutenant General Saburo Kamiura and Lieutenant Colonel Masayuki Oroshi were hanged, and the rest were sentenced to life in prison, but only served 5 years of their sentence. General Fujiwara would be executed by firing squad for his role in the Seorak barracks incident, and General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, would be tried and executed by hanging for war crimes in the Philippines. And this brings us to the end of the video. If you like this video, like and subscribe. See you next time.